Ah, my child, come sit beside me. Today I'm going to take you on a journey through the fall of Rome, once the most powerful empire in the world. This great empire, which rose with glory and honor, beating at the heart of civilization for centuries, how did it fade into dust? What mistakes, what tragedies led to its end? The fall of Rome wasn't a disaster. It was a tragedy. A slow, inevitable, and painful collapse. Power struggles, civil wars, barbarian invasions, and betrayals. All of these spread like a sickness, slowly eating away at the once invincible strength of Rome. Rome didn't fall in a single day, no. After centuries of decline, all that remained of its former glory were ruined walls and forgotten name. But this story isn't just an end, it's a lesson. Rome's mistakes still whisper to us today. How is power lost? How do empires fall? These are the questions we'll seek answers to. Just like the wise historians of the past listening to the echoes of history, now close your eyes and listen. I'm going to take you deep into time. Together we'll witness the first cracks where Rome's collapse began. Now let me take you to the golden days of Rome. Close your eyes and imagine this. Perfect roads stretching across the world, stone arches and triumphal arches, Latin conversations echoing in the marketplaces. On the borders, Roman legions with their helmets shining in the sunlight. This was the golden age of Rome. Centuries ago, under Augustus's leadership, Rome had turned chaos into order. Civil wars had ended, and a time of peace and prosperity had begun. Historians call this era the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. For nearly 200 years, Rome ruled the world. The empire's lands expanded, trade routes grew, and science and art flourished. Rome was no longer just a city, it was a world power. A vast empire was built from England to North Africa, from Spain to Mesopotamia. In the heart of the cities, massive forums, grand baths, palaces, and temples stood tall. Roman merchants traded with China through the Silk Road, Africa's gold coasts, and India's spice markets. And the army, those invincible Roman legions. Each one was trained, disciplined, and ruthless in battle. They protected Rome's borders from barbarian invasions, striking fear into their enemies on the battlefield. Without them, there would be no empire. But Rome's power didn't just come from the sword. Law and order were some of the empire's greatest pillars. Roman law still forms the foundation of modern laws today. The citizenship system upheld social order and united different cultures under one roof. But, my child, every peak has its fall. Even at its brightest, Rome was facing internal struggles. The gap between the rich and the poor was growing, and defending the empire's lands was becoming harder. Like all great empires, Rome was slowly showing the first signs of decay. But we're not there yet. For now, we're still in the height of Rome's glory. Emperors sitting on golden thrones, listening to the advice of the greatest philosophers, and the strongest generals leading their armies from victory to victory. But no glory lasts forever. So, what do you say? Let's take a look at the first tremors after Rome's magnificent rise. After all, every great story has a darker side. Do you remember those good times when I told you about the brightest days of Rome, my child? The glory, the order, the power. But you know, every grand rise has its price, and Rome was about to pay it dearly. Now, let me take you to the days when the Golden Throne started to crack. The empire had expanded so much that controlling it was becoming increasingly difficult. The orderly rule that Augustus once established had turned into a mere fantasy. Emperors came and went, each weaker, more ruthless, and more greedy than the last. Rome was no longer in the hands of one man. It had turned into a chessboard full of betrayal. Listen closely, my child. One of Rome's greatest tragedies was this. The best emperors often died by the stab of a dagger. At first, the throne passed from father to son in an orderly fashion, but over time, that order disappeared. Generals, senators, legion commanders, and even the emperor's closest friends started scheming to take absolute power for themselves. Just think, by 193 AD, the Roman throne was practically up for auction. Yes, you heard that right. After Emperor Pertinax was assassinated, the Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite soldiers, decided to sell the throne to the highest bidder. This tragic event showed that the very soul of Rome had begun to rot. Emperors were now chosen by the legions, sometimes overthrown within months, exiled or brutally murdered. One day a man would wear a golden crown, the next his head would be severed and displayed in the streets of Rome. Between 235 and 284 AD, 26 emperors came to power. Most were assassinated, some betrayed by their own generals, others lost the loyalty of their legions and were cast aside. Rome was no longer an empire. It had turned into a decaying organism, torn apart by internal conflict. Everyone was after more power. The legions no longer fought just to protect Rome, but to make their generals emperors. Rome's greatest enemy was no longer the barbarians, but its own people. In the days of the Roman Republic, the Senate was the center of power. It was where wise elders, statesmen, and the best generals gathered. But as the empire grew stronger, the Senate's voice started to fade. At first, emperors would consult the Senate, seeking their approval, but over time, the Senate became nothing more than a puppet. As emperors started to see themselves as gods, the senators were left in their shadow. Some flattered the emperors to survive, others knelt and swore loyalty. But the greatest ones, they refused to bow. And they paid the price with their lives. Sometimes the Senate would try to overthrow a corrupt emperor, but most of the time it ended in disaster. Either an emperor would completely disband the Senate, or the senators would turn on each other, speeding up Rome's fall. Power no longer lay in the law, morality, or tradition. Power was now in the hands of whoever drew the sword first. Now, my child, this is how the first tremors came after Rome's golden age. Fights for power, corrupt rulers, and bloody battles for the throne. Rome had turned into a battlefield within itself. But don't forget, the fall of an empire isn't only determined by what's inside, it's also shaped by what's outside. As Rome weakened, shadows began to appear along its borders. The Germanic tribes, the Goths, the Huns, they had caught the scent of blood. But we're not there yet. First, we'll talk about how Rome's economy was dragged into a collapse. When money loses its value, when the people go hungry, and when cities descend into chaos, how long can an empire stay standing, do you think? That's the next story. But for now, rest, my child, because the fall of Rome is just beginning. Do you remember the chaotic years when Rome was fighting its own wars, my child? While emperors fought each other for the throne, senators plotted their betrayals, and the people suffered in poverty. No one knew it at the time, but Rome was crumbling from the inside like a tree rotting at its core. And the eyes from the outside, they saw the decay. Barbarians. For centuries, they had been pushing against Rome's borders, sometimes fighting as mercenaries in Rome's ranks, and other times burning and pillaging the land. They were once afraid of Rome's power, but that fear no longer held, because Rome was no longer as strong as it had once been. And like hunters who notice a wounded lion, the barbarians saw Rome's weakness. Now close your eyes, my child. Picture Rome's magnificent borders. Castles stretching along the Rhine and Danube rivers, massive walls where legions stood guard. These once served as the empire's shield, but behind those walls now stood tired, demoralized soldiers, fewer in number. Who were these barbarians? It all started with the Goths knocking at Rome's door. The Germanic tribe, the Goths, had been making small raids along Rome's borders for years. But in 376 AD, everything changed. A great threat from the east. forced the Goths to seek refuge on Roman soil. And that threat? The Huns. The Goths sought asylum from Rome. They fled, terrified of starvation and death. Rome saw this as an opportunity and decided to settle the Goths in its border regions. But these barbarians were starved, mistreated, and eventually they rebelled. And here it is, my child. In 378 AD, at the Battle of Adrianople, Rome suffered a crushing defeat. The Eastern Roman Emperor Valens went to war against the Goths, but his legions were not the disciplined force they once were. The Roman army was wiped out, and the emperor died on the battlefield. This was one of the greatest defeats Rome had suffered against external enemy. But it wasn't just the Goths. The Vandals had also felt Rome's weakness. They advanced through Western Europe, entered Hispania, modern-day Spain, and finally reached North Africa. They seized the vital port of Carthage, and now the control of the Mediterranean was in the hands of the barbarians. And then do you know what happened, my child? The Vandals entered Rome in 455 AD and sacked the city. Those great triumphal arches, the magnificent temples, the imperial palaces, all of it was looted. Rome was at the mercy of the barbarians on its own soil. But even the Goths and Vandals were not Rome's greatest threat. No, my child. There was one name that truly made Rome tremble: Attila. The Huns were a nomadic people from the east. They were so ruthless and powerful that they either destroyed or enslaved every people they came across. Their arrival had already driven the Goths to Rome's borders, but now they were targeting Rome itself. Attila, by the mid-5th century, became a force threatening both the Western and Eastern Roman empires at the same time. He took vast amounts of tribute from Eastern Rome, then set his sights on the West. In 451 AD, he entered Gaul, modern-day France, and came face to face with one of Rome's greatest generals, Flavius Aetius. Aetius gathered an army of Romans and barbarian allies. At the Battle of Chalons, Rome achieved one of its last great victories. Attila had to retreat, but Rome was still in danger. In 452 AD, Attila marched toward the heart of Rome. However, Pope Leo I personally met with him, and for reasons unknown, Attila withdrew. Some say it was the Pope's miracle. Others say it was due to the Huns' army being struck by disease and starvation. But the truth is, Rome had once again narrowly avoided destruction. My child, do you remember the times when Rome was at its peak? The march of a legion, shields shining like steel. The disciplined steps of soldiers under the command of their centurions. Those days were now gone. Rome could no longer feed, train, or maintain loyalty in its army as it once did. Legions began to consist of barbarian mercenaries. The Goths, Franks, Vandals, and other tribes that came to Rome's lands had joined the Roman army, but their loyalty was always in question. Now soldiers fought for money. Many made deals with Rome's enemies, while others plundered cities for their own gain. Once the most feared army in the world, the Roman legions were now divided, undisciplined, and weak. And so Rome could no longer defend its borders. The Huns, Goths, Vandals, Franks, they all played a part in Rome's fall. But my child, the fall of Rome wasn't just due to barbarian invasions. Internal corruption, economic collapse, and the desperation of the people also sped up the destruction. But it's not over yet. Now, I will tell you about Rome's economic collapse and how the people were driven to rebellion in hunger. We are heading toward the times when money lost its value. Hunger and misery spread through every corner of the empire. Are you ready? Ah, son. Great empires are built with swords, but they stand with gold. Rome at its peak wasn't just ruling the world with its armies, but with its economic power too. Those huge roads, massive aqueducts, marble temples, and theaters. All symbols of Rome's wealth. But wealth isn't forever. Over time, even gold melts, treasures run dry, and markets stagnate. and eventually poverty and hunger worked their way into the empire's veins. Rome got rich through conquests. Every new territory meant loot. Every new victory meant more slaves and taxes. But when the empire stopped expanding, that system began to break down. Rome couldn't conquer more land, and its treasury started running low. And then came the inevitable disaster, economic collapse. Son, the biggest danger for an empire isn't outside enemies, it's the unrest brewing inside. When the people lose hope, that's when an empire crumbles. And that's exactly what was happening in the streets, fields, and workshops of Rome. As Rome's treasury started running low, emperors tried to raise taxes to recover their losses. But that only put more weight on the people's shoulders. Farmers, craftsmen, traders, everyone was crushed under the heavy taxes. The middle class, once the empire's greatest strength, had almost disappeared. The rich kept getting richer while the poor kept getting poorer. Small farmers couldn't pay their debts anymore. Many lost their land. Big estates fell into the hands of wealthy senators, and the common people were forced into labor, almost like slaves. So what about the cities? It was even worse. Unemployment was rising, food prices were soaring, and worst of all, the people were facing hunger. For years, Rome had kept the people calm with the bread and circus policy. As the arenas filled with blood, the people were quieted with free bread. But one day, even that free bread couldn't be given out anymore. And son, a hungry people are a dangerous people. Rome's streets began filling with riots. People rose up against the taxes, the poverty, the hunger. Merchants closed their shops, workers went on strike. Even the soldiers weren't getting paid anymore. The big cities, especially Rome itself, once the grandest capital in the world, had now turned into decaying, dirty, chaotic places. But the biggest crisis came with the collapse of the currency. Son, gold is always valuable, but if people start to believe gold is worthless, that's when disaster strikes. To finance wars and expenses, emperors started reducing the precious metal content in silver and gold coins. At first, it seemed like a small change, but over time, Roman coins turned into hollow pieces of copper. And the people noticed. Merchants started refusing to accept Roman coins. The people saw their wages were useless. Prices soared at an incredible pace. Today, a loaf of bread might cost 1 dinar, tomorrow it's 5 dinars, and a week later it could be 10 dinars. This, son, was the deadly rise of inflation. Soon, trading with gold and silver was almost impossible. People had to go back to bartering. Farmers traded grains for cloth, craftsmen swapped pottery for goats. As Rome shifted from a money-based economy back to a primitive barter system, it was witnessing the fall of a great empire. Rome's wealth didn't just come from its army, it came from the security of its trade routes too. The Mediterranean was once Rome's sea. Traders brought wheat from Egypt, spices from Asia Minor, silver from Spain, ivory and slaves from Africa. But son, trade only works when the routes are safe. And Rome could no longer protect those routes. As barbarian raids increased, the roads became unsafe, traders lost their caravans, and ports were attacked. When the Vandals took North Africa, Rome lost its biggest source of wheat. Do you know what that meant? Rome's bread basket was empty. The people faced starvation. The army couldn't find food. Rome's great cities began losing population fast. People fled to the countryside, and cities turned into ghost towns. And son, the mighty Rome had become a starving giant. Great wars, magnificent victories, powerful emperors. But nothing is as deadly as economic collapse. Rome was now an empire fighting not with military victories, but with taxes and inflation. The people were revolting, the rich were hiding their wealth, the merchants were running away, and the barbarians could see this weakness all too well. So, what happened next? Was the fall of Rome stoppable? No, son. Rome was on its deathbed, and what would speed up its collapse would be betrayal and civil war. but I'll tell you more about that in the next story. Because son, Rome's end was drawing near. Now get some rest, son. In the next story, we'll talk about Rome's darkest days, civil wars, betrayals, and the inevitable fall. Ah, son, once Rome rose like an unstoppable power over the world, but sadly it began to crumble under the weight of its own greatness. With its armies, buildings, trade routes, and laws, it once seemed like it was under the protection of the gods. But no empire can stand forever. For centuries, the empire expanded, conquered, and brought Roman order even to the farthest corners of the world. But like everything that grows too large, Rome eventually had to split in two. The real reason for this division wasn't just enemies or economic crises, but also Rome's massive geography. On one side, the West was exposed to harsh European winters and barbarian threats, while on the other side, the East held the rich trade routes and was more stable and prosperous. Rome, with its size, had prepared its own end. Governing it had become impossible. Every border was under threat, and for an emperor to manage everything was a miracle at this point. And so at this point, an emperor named Theodosius rose to power. He did everything he could to prevent the division of Rome, but fate was unavoidable. With Theodosius's death in 395 AD, the empire officially split under the rule of his two sons. In the east, Arcadius ruled the empire from Constantinople, while in the west, Honorius tried to protect his throne in the palace of Ravenna. But the truth was, this division marked the beginning of the end for Rome. Son, the Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantium, controlled the trade routes. Constantinople was overflowing with the wealth of the East, and wheat from Egypt kept the people fed. The economy was more stable and the army was more organized, but the West was being dragged into a difficult time. Barbarian threats were rising, the army was weakening, and the economy was collapsing. The Western Roman Empire was slowly retreating, the people had lost their trust, and the army couldn't find enough resources. And right at that point, the great disasters that brought the West closer to its end came. Son, an empire is the result of power concentrated in one hand. But if that power starts to spread and local lords begin declaring their own power, the end of the empire is inevitable. That's exactly what happened in the West. The empire was vast, but the emperor's word no longer reached the farthest corners of Rome. Local governors began making their own decisions and forming their own armies. Rome's central authority began to fade. The once unified empire was no longer a single fist, but a scattered collection of distrustful regions. And son, the thing that made Rome Rome was its army. But even that army began losing its discipline and loyalty over time. The Roman army, once made up of citizen soldiers, now had mercenaries. Romans who didn't want to serve in the army were replaced by hired soldiers, and this, son, was another reason for the downfall. Many of these mercenaries were barbarians, Germans, Huns, Goths. Once enemies of Rome, these tribes were now fighting for Rome's army. But remember, son, mercenaries fight for money, not loyalty. These mercenaries rebelled when they didn't get paid. Some fought against Rome, and others went under the command of their own lords. And so the very army that had kept Rome standing for hundreds of years was now preparing the empire's end. Son, Rome's fall was now imminent, but the true destruction would come with a great blow. And I will tell you about that in the next story. Ah, son, just think for a moment. That magnificent city, symbolizing grandeur and eternity, once believed to be under the protection of the gods. Rome, on that day, the cries of agony echoing beyond its walls, the flames rising in its stone streets, and the desecration of sacred temples marked the end of an era. It was August 24, 410. For the first time in history, Rome was forced to open its gates to the enemy. But this wasn't just an ordinary defeat. No, this was the moment when an empire, which had ruled the world for centuries, became a prisoner of its own shortcomings. The mastermind behind this disaster was the powerful leader of the Goths, Alaric. His name was whispered in the grand palaces of Rome, for everyone feared his strength. But Rome had long been offering an open invitation to its enemies with its internal struggles, greedy leaders, and weakening armies. Alaric and the Visigoths had come to Rome's gates several times before, but each time some kind of agreement was made. This time, however, peace was replaced by chaos. Alaric and his army poured into Rome like an unstoppable flood, sacking the capital of a 1,000-year-old empire. As they entered the city, neither the magnificent forums nor the temples dedicated to the gods could stop them. The people hid in fear, some tried to escape, while others helplessly prayed to their gods. But that night, Rome realized that even its own gods could no longer protect it. The soldiers plundered even the most sacred sites. Jupiter's great temple, once the highest shrine of the pagan world, now watched in empty silence as it was desecrated. But Alaric was no mere barbarian leader. He was a king searching for a homeland his people deserved. He burned Rome, but he didn't destroy it completely. Historians write that the Goths stayed in the city for 3 days before leaving. 3 days. But those 3 days were enough to shatter the prestige that Rome had built for centuries. Once the empire, with the world's strongest army, the most disciplined state system, and the most unshakable authority, now stood alone, with nothing but its own shadow. The psychological devastation on the people was perhaps greater than the looted temples. The Romans believed that the gods had abandoned the city. Until that moment, barbarian raids had threatened Rome's borders, but the city itself had never fallen. This is why the Visigoths' victory wasn't just a military triumph. It was the destruction of a legend. Rome was still standing, but not as it once was, and this sack became one of the key events that accelerated the fall of the Western Roman Empire. That night, the dream of Rome's eternal greatness shifted from a legend into the dusty pages of the past. Ah, son, history is filled with great storms, but some storms are far more terrifying than others. And one of those storms was one that struck the already worn-out walls of Rome. Attila and his Huns. Attila. That name was like a nightmare even to the most powerful senators of Rome, and it kept them awake at night. They called him the Scourge of God. Wherever he went, he left only destruction and death behind him. His horses' hooves struck the earth so hard that the sky turned gray, and towns and cities vanished in flames. Europe whispered his name in nothing but fear. It was the mid-5th century. Rome was no longer the Rome it once was. The empire that once challenged the world with its legions had now become fragmented, weakened, and torn apart by internal strife. While the Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantium, grew stronger, the Western Roman Empire was desperately struggling to stay alive. And it was in this fragile moment that Attila and his Hunnic army descended on Europe like a hurricane. They first ravaged the Balkans and then turned toward Gaul, modern-day France. The Western Roman Empire, led by General Flavius Aetius, fought back and managed to halt Attila at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains in 451. But this was only a pause, not the end. Attila's eyes were still fixed on Rome. By 452, Attila was marching toward Italy. One by one, the cities of northern Italy fell. Aquileia, Verona, Milan, these powerful cities north of Rome were crushed under the hooves of the Hun horses. The people were in panic, the Senate was scrambling for solutions, and Emperor Valentinianus sat in his palace waiting in fear. Rome's famous legions were no longer what they used to be. The army was weak, filled with mercenaries, and had lost its discipline. Once Rome had instilled fear in the barbarians, but now it seemed as though Rome was at the mercy of the very barbarians it had once conquered. There was no real defense left to protect Rome. The city was facing its greatest danger in history. So who could save Rome? An army? An emperor? No. At this point, history took an interesting turn. Rome was saved not by sword or shield, but by the words of a man. As Attila marched toward Rome, There was no one left to challenge him, but one man showed courage, Pope Leo I. Unarmed, unarmored, and guided only by his faith, this man went to meet Attila. The meeting took place in the north by the banks of the Po River. No one knows exactly what happened during that conversation. Some say Pope Leo's eloquence moved Attila. Others say Attila had a vision of saints descending from the sky and believed that if he attacked Rome, a great catastrophe would befall him. Still others argue that Rome still had an army, and there were more strategic reasons behind Attila's withdrawal. However, whatever the truth, the result was clear. Attila decided to turn away from Rome. He canceled his plans for an attack and retreated with his army. The city had been saved once again. The walls and squares of Rome had, perhaps for the last time, narrowly escaped disaster. But for a wise man, this was merely a delay of the inevitable. Rome had escaped Attila, but it could not escape its own rot. A year later, in 453, Attila died suddenly. Some say from illness, others say from excessive drinking. But with his death, the Hunnic Empire quickly crumbled. Rome, meanwhile, still stood, though no one knew how much longer it would last. The internal decay had already begun, and no one could stop it. And so history sometimes shows us that words can be more powerful than swords, but even those words could only delay Rome's inevitable fate for a time. The fall of Rome didn't happen in a single night. It was a slow and painful death process, like a magnificent tree rotting from within and finally falling down. But there are certain blows that make that process irreversible, and one of those blows was the Vandals' sacking in 455. 45 years earlier, in 410, the Visigoths had sacked Rome. At the time, the people of the city were left in great horror. But ironically, that destruction was only the beginning of what Rome would face. Now, history was repeating itself, but this time another people were entering the scene, the Vandals. Their very name evoked barbarity, the new masters of the Mediterranean. The Vandals were not initially direct enemies of Rome, at least not at first, but like the other barbarian tribes, they too had sensed Rome's weakness. Once roaming along the banks of the Rhine River, this warrior tribe had migrated during the Great Migrations, crossing from Gaul to the Iberian Peninsula and then into North Africa. There, in what is now Tunisia, they had captured Carthage in 439 and began controlling the Mediterranean's trade. This was a deadly blow for Rome. Carthage had been the breadbasket of the Western Roman Empire. Now, Rome was deprived of the wealth that had once come from Africa. Hunger, famine, and chaos began to grow. Then, in 455, an event occurred that would open the gates of Rome wide to the Vandals. At that time, Emperor Valentinian III was on the throne of Rome. However, he was not fit for the imperial crown. He was neither a great soldier nor a powerful leader. He was a weak and indecisive ruler. But in March 455, Valentinian III was assassinated. After his death, chaos erupted in Rome. Petronius Maximus ascended to the throne as the new emperor, but he was also viewed as a weak leader with no legitimacy in the eyes of the people. At this moment, King Genseric of the Vandals saw that Rome was now defenseless. Genseric had made a deal with the Romans in the past. Emperor Valentinian III's daughter, Odoacer, was to be married to Genseric's son. But after Valentinian III's assassination, the new emperor, Petronius Maximus, refused to honor the agreement and tried to marry Odoacer to someone else. This was the perfect excuse for Genseric to attack Rome. Genseric prepared his fleet and set sail across the Mediterranean toward Rome. And once again the people of Rome waited in fear, uncertain of what fate would bring them. On June 2, 455, the Vandals reached the city gates. At that moment, Rome was no longer in a position to defend itself. Once, with its legendary legions, this empire had subdued the world, but now it was left in the hands of a few mercenaries and frightened civilians. Interestingly, this time the gates of the city were opened not by force but by a meeting. Pope Leo I, just as he had done with Attila 3 years earlier, tried to make an agreement with Genseric. He begged him not to burn the city or massacre its people. Unlike Attila, Genseric accepted this offer. However, this did not mean the city would be spared from plunder. The Vandals entered Rome, but unlike the Visigoths, who had sacked the city for only a few days, the Vandals looted it for a full 14 days. Palaces, temples, monuments, all of Rome's wealth was taken. Gold, silver, and valuables from the churches were seized. Whatever the people had, even the imperial treasury, was loaded onto the Vandals' ships, and most tragically, many Romans were enslaved and taken to North Africa. This plunder destroyed whatever was left of Rome's prestige. Once Rome had crushed barbarian tribes. Now it had become the plaything of those very same barbarians. Neither an emperor nor an army could protect it. After this sack, the Western Roman Empire was beyond recovery. The city was in ruins, the people lived in hunger and fear, and most importantly, Rome was no longer the mighty capital that ruled the world. The streets that once trembled with the footsteps of thousands of legions were now silent. After the Vandals left, the Western Roman Empire managed to survive for a few more years, but everyone knew that its collapse was now imminent. Finally, in 476, when the last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed, the Western Roman Empire officially came to an end. And so, son, despite its glorious past lasting over 1,000 years, Rome could not resist the destructive power of time. Neither its great legions nor its powerful emperors could save it. Who would have believed that this city, once feared across the world, would one day fall to the mercy of barbarians? But remember, history always repeats itself. An empire rises, and then it falls, and then a new one is born. Perhaps one day another Rome will rise. But until that day comes, the ghost of ancient Rome will continue to echo through history. Son, every great story has an end, and Rome's was written here in 476 with the fear in the eyes of a young boy. His name was Romulus Augustulus, and he was the last emperor of Rome. Once, great emperors like Augustus, Trajan, and Marcus Aurelius had sat upon the throne. But now, the last representative of this magnificent dynasty was a child. Rome was on the edge of collapse, its power lost, and what was once a legendary empire had turned into a weary and exhausted shadow. But this fall was not sudden. For centuries, civil wars, economic crises, and barbarian invasions had weakened Rome. The emperors were no longer the true leaders of the army. Even Rome's legions were nearly entirely made up of mercenaries. And the greatest irony was that the army, which was supposed to protect the emperor, became the force that overthrew him. By the time 476 came, there was no real power left in Rome. Even the army was now under the control of Germanic mercenaries. And on that day, the Germanic commander Odoacer stepped onto the stage. Odoacer was a barbarian warrior who had risen through the ranks in the army, but now he was the one who would determine Rome's fate. In the autumn of that year, Odoacer marched towards Rome and reached the gates of the palace. There was no resistance because Rome no longer had the strength to resist. Inside the palace was the young Romulus Augustulus. He had ascended to the throne just a few years earlier, barely old enough to be called a child. But for Odoacer, whether Romulus was an emperor or not didn't matter. Rome was now just a name. And so, the final act in history's great drama came to a close. Odoacer deposed Romulus Augustulus. However, he did not kill him. Perhaps he felt pity for the boy. He exiled him, sending him to a monastery. What became of Romulus afterward is uncertain, but the one thing we know for sure is this. He was Rome's last emperor. With the deposition of Romulus Augustulus, the Western Roman Empire was officially at an end. Odoacer declared himself king of Italy, but made no claim to the title of emperor. The Eastern Roman Empire, or the Byzantine Empire, was forced to recognize Odoacer, for there was no longer any real authority left in the West. This marked the end of a civilization that had lasted for 1,000 years. Rome was a power built with sword and blood, victorious in countless wars, establishing legal systems, building roads, and carrying culture and art to the world. But those days were now behind it. Rome was being buried in the pages of history. And so, son, this is where Rome's story ends. But remember, history never truly ends. The fall of Rome was merely the closing of one era, but its legacy, its knowledge, its culture did not disappear. Today we still use the roads built by Rome, benefit from its legal system, and keep its art, philosophy, and even its language alive. Rome fell, but its spirit did not die. Remember this: great empires rise, grow, and eventually fall, but their legacy continues to live on in human history. Who knows, perhaps Rome will one day be reborn. Perhaps another empire will rise with the same grandeur. But whatever happens, history will always remember. Rome was not just a city, it was a civilization, and that civilization will be remembered forever. Now, close your eyes and imagine those ancient Roman streets once more. Walk under those great arches, walk upon those stone-paved roads, and behold the grandeur of the Colosseum. For Rome did not die, Rome will always live.